I am Vinnie Tortorich, folks. Your good intentions have been stolen, but don't worry. I'm here to help you get them back. You may be soft and succulent when we start this process, but hang in there. Before long, you will be lean and mean, guaranteed, just like the woman who wrote one of my favorite books of all time. As a matter of fact, I'm not just saying it's one of my favorite books of all time. I recommend her book more than I recommend my own book. I stand to make money on my book. But when people go, hey, if you can read one book, read Nina's book. And there's a reason why. And we'll start off by talking about that with Nina, but then Nina's going to get into some nitty gritty here because we have some really good information. Let's welcome, please, Miss Nina Teicholz. How you doing, Pumpkin?
Hey, Vinny, thank you so much for having me on your show, and thanks for those nice comments.
Well, it's true because whenever anyone says to me, "Look, I can go down the list. I can recommend, and I do recommend other books. I recommend Dr. Avadia. I recommend um, some of Perlmutter's stuff, the early books, and all that kind of stuff. Gary Taubes, there's two or three of his books I tell people are must reads, especially Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, because it's a dumbed down version of Good Calorie, Bad Calorie, and on and on and on. But if people say to me, one book, what would you read? It's not my book. It's not Gary's books. It's not William Davis. It's your book. And there's a reason for that. You took more time than any of us to do the research and really show what happened and how we ended up here. I don't think anyone else has done that before or since. Or can you think of anyone? I know we're talking about your book, but can you think of anyone?
Well, thank you. I mean, the book is called The Big Fat Surprise for your listeners or viewers. I think that Gary Taubes' Good Calories, Bad Calories was certainly covered much of the history that I cover. If people want to understand why they might be interested in my book, and again, thank you for being so kind about it, but it is, I think, the most general reader accessible book on this history of how we got to a place where we have nutrition recommendations that, one, don't reflect the science, and two, are very likely harmful for health. And so when I mean nutrition recommendations, I mean like our national policy. But if you believe that fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, fish, lean meat is what you should be eating to become healthier, that is our national policy. If you believe we should have vegetable oils over saturated fat, that is our national policy. So my book was the first book to do also to do a couple things, which is I was the first really to set out all the arguments for why saturated fat, long demonized in meat, butter, eggs, cheese, why that is not bad for health, how we came to believe it's bad for health, and what are the arguments and the science showing that actually that has never been true. Also, I did I think the first kind of body of research on vegetable oils, showing like what's the history? Why are we considering as a health food these oils that were created to lubricate machinery in the industrial age? How did they come into the food supply? Why are they dangerous? So yeah, so I mean, I think if I made contributions at all, I think those would be them. And it remains true, just that it's still important reading, in my view, because our ideas about food haven't changed. We are still stuck in our kind of antiquated beliefs. Our views haven't, for the most part, caught up with the science, except for maybe among your listeners. So we are still like dealing with this kind of ancient paradigm, this dogma that has existed. And even if we ourselves have read and understood that's not true, we still face in visiting our doctors, our friends, our loved ones, our everybody around us, kind of a universe of people who don't understand what we understand. So you can either ask them to read the book or whack them over the head with it.
Well, I look at what's going on basically in social media, what you're doing, what I'm doing, what we're all doing. And as I put it now, we now have an epidemiological study. When I started this show 10 years ago, I was an M1 experiment. but not really, because I've been doing it in Hollywood with people for years. That was my trade secret. And I wasn't the only guy that was doing an Atkins approach to get people to lose weight. I didn't invent any of it. That's why I felt somewhat of a fraud when I was writing my book. Um, but it's this information that a whole generation had never heard, and that M1 experiment went to people trying it and more people trying it, and people like you and Gary and Tim Noakes and on and on, coming on my early shows talking about this stuff. And then more and more people tried it. And then Dr. Drew and Adam Carolla somehow found me, and that really turned the page. And then more people were able to find it. And more recently, we have a whole new audience. That's why I want your book to go out there, because I was on Mike Rowe's podcast at the beginning of the years, and we saw my numbers jump to numbers we haven't seen in years. So people are trying it, people are losing weight, and then they get on the phone with me and they're mad. They're mad because they've taken metformin, Ozempic, because some of these drugs are stacked on top of other drugs because the drugs aren't working. And these people are mad. They're not mad at me. They're not mad at you, Nina. They're mad because their doctor didn't know the truth. The doctor handed them a drug, and some idiot that grew up on a bayou went on a show and said, try this. And in 6 months, they're off of drugs. Not all drugs, but some drugs. And it makes them mad, right?
Right.
So, the other day, and this is going to lead into what we're talking about, I read something. Actually, I didn't read it. My friend Gina Grad sent it to me. And it said that the FAA is getting together with Congress to figure out how to make seats wider in airplanes, because it's now an issue that not only are people spilling into other people's seat and the whole thing, but it's a safety issue. If they have to crash land, people can't get out of their seats. They're not wide enough. So we have an act of Congress, not to fix a problem, but how to placate the problem. I hope I'm using the right word. I think I am. We're just placating, right? I was in Target the other day buying something, and the models up on the thing. Models used to be Lilthy and Wafy and the whole thing. Now they're not just bigger women; they're morbidly obese women. And I don't laugh about this. I think the acceptance of this is the problem. It's not the solution. We don't just say, hey, we can make models fatter so that everyone can feel good about themselves. It doesn't make type 2 diabetes go away. It doesn't make fatty liver disease go away. It doesn't make sleep apnea go away, and a host of other problems. And what I said in my thing was the act of Congress should be to change the food pyramid, not make seats wider, not make models bigger. We need an act of Congress to do. I know you were with the Nutrition Coalition for a while. You started that, and now is moving on. And someone said, and I saw one in the comments, and a guy goes, well, no one follows that pyramid anyway. And I don't believe that, because schools are following it, hospitals are following it, municipalities are following it. What say you, Nina? Is anyone paying attention to this pyramid?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. The food pyramid comes from the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans, our nation's top nutrition policy, and that is required by law to determine all federal food programs to include food in schools, military food, feeding programs for the elderly, for the poor. But it is a de facto followed by many more because it is considered the gold standard. So it's downloaded by all doctors, healthcare workers, nutritionists, dietitians. It's used in pretty much across the healthcare system. So when you think I'm going to my doctor to get healthcare advice or my nutritionist, what you're actually getting is the guidelines. And again, that is more fruits, vegetables, whole grains. If you just stop there, that is the basic advice that most people are given when they go to their doctors to improve their health, or anybody about nutrition. And so yes, they are very, very powerful, these guidelines. And it's a little bit worrisome, or quite a lot worrisome, that there are a number of proposals now before Congress not to change those guidelines so that they could make people healthy according to the science that we know can swivel these diseases into reverse. there are proposals to expand the reach of those dietary guidelines so
Oh,
that
God.
more people get them, more education, more, I mean, the idea is correct in that we need more nutrition education, right? We need to tell people how to solve diet-related diseases with diet. Instead, we have a system where doctors are trained to understand the body as like 1,000 different systems, right? Because that's the way they code their visits and their diagnoses when they send them to the health insurance companies. So if you come in with a headache, that's one thing, completely unrelated to the fact that you might have obesity or that you have irritable bowel syndrome, or you have 10 different conditions and they're all treated separately and you're given a separate medication for each one of those. But doctors are not taught to think of your body systemically. And that's the fault of medical education, which is greatly influenced by the pharmaceutical companies that are, each of which has a pill or some other medication for each of those conditions. So, but the reality is that it is better food and nutrition that doctors think of as kind of like, as kind of child stuff. Nobody talks about nutrition. The way you are, a kind of a macho doctor is to cut people open. So nutrition is seen like the poor stepchild in the medical education, but it is true that nutrition, better food, is the one thing that we can do that will systemically reverse these diseases, right? That all have a common cause, right? They're all caused by having too much circulating insulin, your body's energy systems. You can't even use your energy for fuel in the way that you should. So it is true that we do need more nutrition, but if we teach more of the existing nutrition paradigm, right? If that essentially the food pyramid's been retired now, but let's just say if that food pyramid goes out to more and more people, we will have more and more sick people. So we need to, so the solution is not to give more of this incorrect advice. But that is sadly the way that there's a tremendous push right now in Washington, D.C. with a number of different bills to try to push these dietary guidelines on more and more people. And let's be clear, like only 7% of Americans are now considered metabolically healthy. That means that they don't have any of the symptoms that are included in metabolic disease, including like some of your cholesterol markers or high blood pressure or fat, the degree or placement of fat on your body. Those are all markers of metabolic disease. But basically, all the markers that say that you are not well and are likely to be on a medication. So only 7% of us are considered healthy, according to a study that just came out this year. That's mind-boggling, really. And we don't talk about obesity. And I think, so I just make one more point. The conversation on obesity is really changing from 5 years ago when there was a conversation about the seriousness of obesity. Obesity travels with every other one of these diseases: polyovary cyst, POCS, fatty liver disease, heart disease, even cancers, all travel with obesity together. Very likely because they have the same root cause. 43% of Americans have obesity, right? That's not just being overweight. 43% have obesity. 5 years ago, you could talk about that being a national health crisis. Now the conversation has really shifted to that has made it very difficult to talk about obesity because it's considered to be being insensitive to people who might be differently abled. Maybe they can't exercise because they're physically disabled, or even racist because they live in a neighborhood where they can't get outside and exercise, or it's considered sort of a bias to talk about obesity, even when was it Alicia Keys or who was it who lost a lot of weight, and people said, well, maybe that's a bad example for her fans, or she's not being her true authentic self.
Yeah, it was the British woman. Her name is not Alicia Keys. I can't think of it right now, but I was just thinking when you were saying this, I was thinking of that because if you notice in my little diatribe at the top of the show, I mentioned, being in Target and seeing the fat mannequins. Let me just be perfectly honest with you. I'm going to get kickback from that because
Right.
because people are going to say to me online, "Hey, man, why are you saying that? I'm a big woman. I'm a big guy. Shouldn't I feel good about?" No, I'm not. I
Well,
don't shame anyone. I'm just saying
right.
that we can't make the new paradigm that, oh, it's okay to be this way, because you could be proud and happy and like the way you look. I'm all for it because I'm the first person to say fat shaming has never helped anyone. This is not fat shaming. But when you normalize it, when we start normalizing this is when we have a problem because you're not healthy. It was Adele, by the way.
Yeah.
It just took me a minute.
Oh, that's right.
And,
It's Adele. So
and
you're right. I
but
mean,
let me just continue for just a second with Adele. Adele got crap for losing weight. So what does the other girl do? She's uh, the she's the rapper, very heavy set. Can't think of
I
her
don't know.
name now. You see, we should eat differently, Nina. We would remember. But now that woman's going in the opposite direction, going, I'm fat, I'm black, I'm beautiful, and the whole thing. Okay, you could be all of those things, but you're not healthy. You're not healthy. That's the
Well, right.
problem.
So we all have to say we don't want anybody to feel unhappy or disrespected at any size, right? Exactly. There should be no shaming of people. And I think that the spirit of that comes from this strong line of reasoning that has been erroneous, but nevertheless promoted far and wide, that obesity comes from overeating and under exercising. In other words, you are lazy and you are gluttonous. That is incorrect. That is not the source of obesity, but it did stigmatize people to give them that message. And there's no reason to make people feel badly for suffering from having been given the wrong advice or the inability to have access to good foods. But it is still undeniably true in the scientific literature that obesity tracks with ill health in a number of ways, with diabetes, with, all these conditions that we mentioned, and with reduced mortality, that people are likely to die sooner if they're obese, not necessarily if they're overweight. So that is just an undeniable reality of the scientific literature. So we can't deny the science. And so we have to take obesity seriously. It's part of our national health problem, and we have to be able to talk about it. So maybe it's a good way to segue into this paper that I co-wrote with, and we could talk about the authors in a second, but it came out in a journal of the National Academy of Sciences, which is, invitation only. It certainly was not something I expected ever to do. And I would say it's the most significant critique of our dietary guidelines ever to be published. And probably what's even more significant about it is that its authors include several former members of previous dietary guideline expert committees. There's committees that are appointed for each go around of the guidelines, which happens every 5 years. So these are people who reviewed the science for the guidelines. They were in charge. One of our authors was the chair of the 2005
Wow.
Dietary Guideline Committee. So these are people saying this process has gone off the rails and we are making incorrect recommendations, and nobody has done this before. And one of the things that has gone off the rails is that, going back to our conversation on obesity, one of the things that's gone wrong is that for the last iteration of the guidelines, which came out in 2020, the expert committee that time around did not even look at the literature on weight loss. They completely ignored the problem of obesity in the US. Now, their explanation was that, obesity, if somebody loses weight, they get better in every possible way, in terms
Right.
of their metabolic health. So we don't want that confuses the outcomes of other studies. So we don't want to, we don't
Jesus
want
Christ.
something that gets in the way of our having clear univariable results. Well, that's so absurd.
Nina, no, wait,
One, it
don't
underscores
pass.
our point. Losing weight is really important, but two, you know, that's part of the solution in these clinical trials that they decided to ignore. Sorry, go ahead.
That's the part that drives me nuts. Why would you ignore an outcome that's happening right in the middle of a study? Are they have that much of a blind set of blinders on that they're going to just keep mowing ahead, going, we have to throw this out? It doesn't help with the study. How does that work? Or why does that work?
I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of why these decisions are made, because there's not enough rationality behind them to try to even discuss it. Most of these decisions that are taken in these expert processes, I say expert in air quotes, they are completely irrational from the perspective of public health. In a country where 43% of the people have obesity, you cannot ignore there's no possible explanation for ignoring the entire literature on weight loss. That's just not explainable. So they also ignored the entire scientific literature on low carbohydrate diets. We can maybe just discuss their history, a sort of sad history of how they have treated the low carbohydrate literature, which now numbers, there are more than 1,000 clinical trials on this diet. Okay, a clinical trial is grade 1 level evidence. It's the kind of evidence that can show cause and effect. It's the evidence, and only the kind of evidence that can be used to approve a pharmaceutical. They have to have grade 1 level evidence, right?
Right.
There's over 1,000 of these trials. So back in 2015, the dietary guidelines experts decided that there was a conversation that I obtained that happened over email, and I got through a Freedom of Information Act request that was not disclosed to the public. And it was about the fact that they had reviewed the low carbohydrate diet, and they had done a formal, what's called a systematic review of the literature. They had found 43 studies on this diet. This is in 2015. There were many more at the time, but they found 43, and they decided not to publish it. They didn't publish the review, and they stuffed any discussion of it in the methodology section where it doesn't belong. It wasn't in the results section where it could have been used.
Why?
And well, there's no explanation, again, no reason to speculate because we'll never know. But I will tell you that one member of the expert committee, Harvard professor Frank Hoop, piped up over email and said, we really should not be burying this. He used the word burying this in the methodology section, and because it's a substantial body of scientific literature, and it needs to, and it's shown to be better for weight loss, and so we need to publish it. And in fact, the staff at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees this whole process and sort of has actually, one of the things we found is that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has really kind of rested and taken control of the whole process, and the outside experts amount to little more than window dressing at this point. But the USDA officials basically said, we know that people are asking us why this is not the low carbohydrate diet is not the dietary pattern that we recommend of choice. And yet at the same time, they decide to not even discuss their findings on it. So that was 2015. 2020, the next time the guidelines come up, they decide they're going to review low carbohydrate diets formally, publicly. They did a review. They could find 0 studies on the low carbohydrate diet in 2020. I mean, anybody in this field, even reading casually, knows that that there are dozens and dozens of these studies. They're widely reported on. They're you should be, if you're up to date in the scientific literature, there's studies coming out all the time. These 20 experts on the committee who, again, are a little more than window dressing at this point, but still, and all of the experts at the USDA, they didn't find a single study. They themselves had found 43 studies 5 years earlier, but now they found 0. So, we're now facing yet another dietary guidelines, which the whole process is starting again. And they're saying we're not going to study low carbohydrate diets. At this point, we don't know if they will or if they won't. They had a
Does
public
anyone
comment period.
stand up at some point and say, hey, listen, this is happening. We're seeing this happening in real time. There are doctors who are changing. There's Tim Noakes. There's Gary Fettke. We have these cases now, case studies in different countries around the world where these people were saving limbs and saving lives and everything else. Doesn't someone stand up to Walter Willett and the boys over at Harvard and say, hey, because you mentioned one of the Harvard doctors, can't he walk across the hall and go, hey, listen,
Yeah.
there were 43. And by the way, let me ask a different question. Are there any of the same people on the committee from 2015 that are looking at this in 2020? And is anyone going, wait a minute, wasn't there 40 something somewhere?
Yes. Well, in fact, all the staff members at USDA had been there 2015. They were on the email chain, still there at 2020. So they are the institutional memory for that process.
Amnesia.
But I think at this point, I think at this point it's pretty fair to say that they are doing everything they can to suppress this science. And this was even though the Nutrition Coalition, which is a group that I founded, had helped bring to the public meetings of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. There were maybe more than 24 doctors who stood up and talked about their clinical experience, cardiologists, researchers, Dr. Sarah Halberg, was the head of the largest clinical trial ever undertaken to put type 2 diabetes into remission. They stood up and they gave testimony directly to the committee, and none of that. I mean, at the end, there was sort of a kind of chagrined statement by somebody who said, well, despite what we heard from people at our public meetings, we just couldn't find any of that literature. There was even an instance where somebody on the committee, she herself had published on the low carbohydrate diet, but she didn't speak up either. Her study found that low carbohydrate was superior.
They're being paid off, and obviously they're being paid off by big food and maybe even big pharma. What say you on that? Because people don't get amnesia that fast, Nina. So what's actually going on?
Right. Well, another study paper that I was on recently was the first ever systematic look at all of the conflicts of interest on the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. And, I know that I've just said that they are mainly window dressing for this process. And, but it's still significant that we found that 95% of these committee members had at least one tie to industry, and more than half of them had 20 ties or more. And let me just give you an example. There was on the committee was somebody named Jamie Ard, who since 2009 has served as the medical director for Nestle's OptiFast program, which is a weight loss through a formula food replacement. And he'd also received $431,000 or almost $500,000 from Nestle to study OptiFast. And so, that's where he has a conflict of interest, because he is invested in a non-food solution to obesity, and he's then been tasked with finding a food-based solution that would in no way benefit him. So there was also the former global director of scientific affairs and obesity at Merck, which is a pharmaceutical company. There were many, many pharmaceutical conflicts of interest. There were many members who had been funded by the nut industry, and there has been in the dietary guidelines a steady erosion of what they call the protein category, but which was used to be meat, eggs, and now has increasingly been defined as nuts and seeds, and actually fake meats and soy are all considered now to be, those have made inroads. So, I mean, we found that the chair of the committee had previously served as the president of the Dannon Institute, which is connected to Danone yogurt, and they have many different dairy products, most of them quite sugary.
Yeah.
But there were just and maybe one of the most common conflicts of interest was just a group called ILSI, which is International Life Sciences Institute, which has been known as there's many articles now talking about its links to the sugar soda industry and how it promotes sugary sodas and it's basically the largest multinational corporations are all members of that association. So those conflicts are pervasive in the committee. But I wanted just to make one more point that we also looked at the monies that these committee members were getting from the National Institutes of Health and the USDA. So they get millions and millions of dollars collectively from the very government agencies that oversee the guidelines. So if you were to tentatively raise your hand and say, hey, I think we got it wrong on saturated fats or cholesterol or the low carb diet, it's quite possible that you could see that grant money disappear. And that grant money can very well be far more important to you in terms of the prestige of your money, your funding for science, and your very ability to do science. That money could be far more important to you than whatever you're getting from a nut company.
Right.
So, yeah, I think so. I mean, that's another way in which there's a bias built in to the system where if they do not want to disturb their ability to be part of this community where they're being funded by, it's very prestigious to have an NIH grant. And then there's just like a whole nother level of corruption that, as you say, the food industry, I mean, the US Department of Agriculture, their constituents are the food industry. They are there to serve the agricultural and food interests of America. And that has long been a conflict of interest for the one agency to both promote food and agriculture and yet also tell Americans which of those foods to eat and which to cut back on. Right? It's just but they have dozens and dozens and dozens of partnerships with the food industry, and so there's something called a captured agency, where an agency can no longer serve the public because it's serving the corporate interests that are involved in its programs. And I think the USDA shows many signs of being that kind of agency.
And there's nothing coming down the pike that can bust any of this up because there's so much money. Or am I wrong? I mean, look, I look at things that happen to me, and I'm just a little guy. You start shouting from the rooftops and you see things happening to you in social media and everywhere else. And it's mind boggling, why are they going after little old me? Why would they care? Well, they care when you start making a difference, and I've seen it happen to other people. So is there any hope? And you and I talked about this privately one night at an event. Is there any hope? Right? I mean, that what we're talking about will ever change anything. We don't have that kind of money.
Well, I would like to be hopeful in the sense that, like, I think that, so this group that I started, the Nutrition Coalition, I encourage people to go there, nutritioncoalition.us, and just sign up for the newsletter. And we were, in the last iteration of the guidelines, we played an important role in actually preventing some things from getting worse. They very much wanted to reduce the caps on saturated fat even further. That would mean less meat, less dairy, fewer eggs, and all of that would have been reduced in the meals we have for children, the meals we have for the elderly. I think I've been told by several people, pretty much single-handedly stopped that from happening. So we do have like a finger in the dike kind of function, but I think we can be even more hopeful beyond that, in the sense that I still think that the science is really rapidly increasing, and the number of people that have benefited from it is also increasing. And we have a new set of initiatives to try to coordinate and organize people to make our voices louder. I mean, think of some of the positive things that have happened in just the past year. There have been 2 shows in ABC News TV, that Good Morning America and one of the nighttime shows, one of the major shows, that featured the low carb diet, and everybody on Good Morning America was talking about it as if they had always known that that diet was a diet that worked. That was stunning. And we've seen the American Diabetes Association has been forced to recognize the science on low carb, and maybe begrudgingly, but they are slowly shifting their website over to reflect that science. So now they have their food plate, half of it says, they say, only get a quarter of your foods from carbohydrate sources. And they count fruit in that, which is, good, I think, extraordinary. And there are a number of things happening in Congress which may change. I can't really talk about them yet, but
that's okay.
People to like, yeah, I mean, I think there is some reason for hope. So I encourage people to sign up, and we plan to enroll a number of initiatives that will help people, people can get involved if they want, or they can donate money. I mean, obviously you're right, money does speak, but we're we have something that really many other movements don't, which is that we have incredible success stories, and we have authentic, genuine people. And I know that all of that can be manufactured if you have enough money. But, when I look at some of our nutrition leadership and I see that there's nobody following them on social media, they cannot generate the public support, the kind of public support that I think that we can.
I want to switch over to a little bit to another paper and another study of the new, going away from the pyramid and this new cereal thing you were talking about. It went viral. But before we do that, I have to take a quick break. By the way, folks, in case you missed it when she said it, it's called nutritioncoalition.org. Nutritioncoalition.org.
No, nutritioncoalition.us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Don't go to .org. Go to nutritioncoalition.us. And I'll give it out again at the end of the show, and hopefully I'll get it right then. Folks, Villa Capelli olive oil is the longest running sponsor of this show. They've been with us for almost 10 years. Look, I believe in this product so much that I use it over at my vitamin company with my vitamin D3. You have to hook D3 to an oil. Most people hook it to a seed oil. Now, just to be perfectly honest, that amount of seed oil will not do anything to you. It's a drop. That's not going to kill you. But you know what? In order to be optimal, I'm not going to use any seed oils. I'm not going to pay one dime for it. And I want people to be as healthy as possible. We actually use Villa Capelli over at purevitaminclub.com. If you want to get, there's 3 ways to save when you go to Villa Capelli, because real olive oil is not cheap. It's just not. In America, they could cut it up to 40% and still call it real olive oil. Maybe we should ask Nina about that when we come back. But folks, Villa Capelli, 3 ways to save. Number 1, get that 3-liter 10. When you buy in bulk, obviously cheaper. Number 2, put in promo code Vinnie, VINNIE, no wimpy Y, and you'll get 10% off. Now, here's the 3rd way. If you spend more than $100 after the Vinnie discount code, you get free shipping. Come on, man, that's a deal. So get yourself a 3-liter 10, get a couple of spices, get a few other things, get it to about $120, get that 10% off. And then what else? Oh, yeah, just free shipping. VillaCapelli.com. Let them know we sent you. Promo code Vinnie. We're talking to Nina Teicholz. The book is called Big Fat Surprise, one of my favorite books. I not only have read it, I also, I keep it on, I call it speed dial, but it's on my Audible books. And every now and then I'll go back when I'm doing long hikes or long kayak runs or something. I'll pop it in my ears. And, you always hear something that you've forgotten. I do that with many books, and this book is great for that. So go check it out. Also, it's nutritioncoalition.us. Nina, you went somewhat viral just a few weeks ago when you showed this new, it's not a pyramid, they're doing somewhat of a graph, right? And you were showing all the things that were above an egg or better than an egg to eat. Was that it? Did I get that wrong? Because I saw it.
No, it's a good start. And maybe if you have graphics in your show, you can show it. But it's what it was a graphic representation of a food rating system called the Food Compass that had been published by Darush Mozaffarian, who's the dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition and Policy at Tufts University. And we could talk about why he's important later, but he's very influential in nutrition policy, especially right now. And this food rating system had been criticized in another paper, and it was their chart that I published because it showed what he had ranked, and he had ranked 70 brand name cereals by name, including Lucky Charms and Cheerios and Frosted Mini Wheats, to be far healthier than a boiled egg or eggs fried in butter or ground meat. Ground meat was at the very bottom in red. And his green go foods also included ice cream with nuts and chocolate covered almonds. Cheerios got a score of 95 out of 100 and was considered one of the most healthy foods you could possibly eat. And it just went on and on, these crazy valuations that he gave. And that paper critiquing the Food Compass, that actually, they couldn't actually publish that in a peer-reviewed journal, probably because it went after, it was so shocking. But it certainly made all the rounds of social media again and again. I've seen that chart, and it's astonishing for a couple of different reasons, but mainly because, we talk about the influence of the food industry, but here it was like laid out bare. There's cereals, everything named by brand name. Post General Mills, Kellogg cereals, and even though they hadn't paid for the study overtly, there was clearly some way in which they had made their importance felt to this research team from Tufts. And I think it's also worrisome or deeply worrisome because this he's called Dari Mozaffarian, he is the lead number one most influential and mastermind behind the upcoming White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health. This is a multi-million-dollar effort that is going to take place at the White House on September 28th. And he has been involved since 2017, at least, convening task forces, writing white papers. They have a whole host of who's people behind it. And it's hard to know about Mozaffarian because on the one hand, he's come out saying sugars and starches are a problem for metabolic health. He's come out and said and written a paper saying obesity is not as simple as calories in, calories out. So he has published work that suggests that he understands some of these issues, but at the same time, he's put out this just absurd food compass. And who knows which way the wind will blow for him in this White House conference. From what I can tell, they want to promote food as medicine, good idea again, but what is that medicine?
Are you in Vegas all of a sudden?
Me?
Yeah, it's got to be you.
Sorry.
So Nina, the compass was put out. Look, if you say, Vinnie, this guy, he's obviously leaning in a direction. Which direction do you think he's leaning in? And then he puts a compass out with 70 different cereals on it. Shouldn't I automatically expect it's going to go in that direction? I mean, this sounds like a much lazier version than the McGovern committee that met for 10 years. Let's just go in there and shove something else down their throat, more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the general counsel for that McGovern committee that you refer to, which is the 1977 Senate Select Committee on Nutrition that formed the original document that became the Dietary Guidelines, the lawyer in charge of that process is also involved in this go around. He's still, his name is Marshall Matz. He believes the Dietary Guidelines were a great success and is very proud of them, and is still quite influential in Washington, D.C., and is writing op-eds in support of the conference. So there are so many interests behind this conference. It is really hard to know which way it will go, but I'm not optimistic for a lower carbohydrate approach, simply because they have invited nobody from the burgeoning field, doctors, researchers, practitioners who are involved in helping people reverse their metabolic diseases. Nobody from that field has been invited. So, I mean, the interests that I see represented are the vegan vegetarian interest, very well represented.
Right.
The investment community, hedge fund people, investment groups who are going to start new companies with devices, apps, programs, very well represented at this conference. In fact, there's one hedge fund manager from Silicon Valley called Jun Yun, who has spent millions, it must be, funding all of the meetings and convenings, and has been involved in this from the start. So I don't know what they're investing in, but I see that they're quite well represented. And then what I see is many, many people, such as this lawyer, who are very much involved in the status quo, former USDA secretaries, former FDA commissioners, former USDA employees. I mean, people who have been the architects or overseers of this failed nutrition policy. I think it's Albert Einstein who said, you can't solve problems with the same thinking that got you into them in the first place.
Yeah.
What I don't see is any new thinking at this conference in terms of nutrition.
Yeah, there's a saying, I shoot skeet competitively, and a lot of times the only time you miss is when you do something wrong, right? There's the mental aspect, and there's, the way you swing. It's kind of like playing golf. And one of my favorite sayings is, if you miss one, don't do exactly the same thing, miss somewhere else. And you're gonna hit it. Like we're always, when we know someone can easily hit a 25, we go, they'll miss one. Just put your gun down, relax for a second. Now go miss somewhere else, which means you're gonna get it right. We keep missing in the same spot with this, and I always call it the Woodstock Effect. 1969. Well, McGovern had been meeting for 1 year at that point, but in 1969 you have Woodstock. And these are not triathletes. They're not marathoners. These are just normal American kids, beer drinking, wine drinking, dope smoking kids who just want to watch some people sing in love and the whole thing. Go find the fat person in that crowd. Most of these kids have ab muscles, and not just the guys, but the girls. And nobody was there because they were there for the Arnold Schwarzenegger bodybuilding competition. These people we had abs in 69. You're younger than me, Nina, but in my child, well, not my child. I was probably 19 or 20. I was in my 20s. The commercial for Total Cereal, I think it was Total, that said, if you can pinch an inch, you're too fat. This was a commercial that was on television. If you can pinch an inch, you're too fat. Can you imagine?
That would be fat-shaming.
Yeah, that was a commercial in 1970. And the girl I was trying to think of before, Lizzo, beautiful woman, incredible talent. But I think Lizzo looks at Adele and goes, I'm not going to lose a pound. I don't need that fight. So instead, she goes whole hog in the opposite direction. And the reason I keep bringing this stuff up is because it's just not what's going on behind the scenes. It's what they're putting in front of us, right? They're putting wider seats in planes. They're putting fat models at Target. They're telling us Lizzo is perfection and Adele, that's wrong, right? This is the message we're giving young people. And I don't think it's a good road to go down.
Well, it obviously isn't. But again, like I sympathize with people because they have been given the wrong advice. Many people have worked very hard to get well based on the wrong advice. I mean, sometimes I think about the people who are trapped in these wellness programs at corporations where their pay is docked or their vacation is docked, or they're actually punitive measures connected to their ability or inability to lose weight, and they're being told to go on a low fat diet, and which doesn't work. So it's been a kind of tragic system for people, and we still are not giving people the right advice. On the whole, mainstream nutritional advice is not the correct advice for people to get better. So, and there are I think that you're absolutely right to be worried about our shrinking ability to discuss these issues. I don't see that as a casual evolution in our conversation, our national conversation. I'm fairly sure that there's quite a lot of PR money behind that, trying to push people and narrow the space of conversation, which we see happening in numerous different areas where we previously had kind of healthy, open debates about a number of topics, and that has been shrinking in many different spheres. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the good news is there are more and more doctors and researchers who are responsive to what they're seeing around them, and you can't stop the march of people who are improving their health, going to their doctors, people waking up, even if they're not policymakers or they're not senators or congressmen. I mean, there is this kind of steady march of progress that is happening at a grassroots level.
Do you think you look at people like Brett Shear, Dr. Philip Avadia, Trokalasian, you look at all these doctors, Brian Linsky's, I could just go on and on and on, the aforementioned Gary Fettke and Tim Noakes. If you get enough of these doctors that just go, hey, I've had enough. I've had enough. I can't keep people sick on drugs for the rest of their life. These guys changed and started working with people. They dropped out of the big programs and just opened up their own shop, hung out their own shingle. Or do we now have a system that's just so fraught, and we have so many of these young doctors coming out of college with close to $1 million in debt, and they need to go work for someone who's going to give them a paycheck every month that's going to say, hey, doc, you need to do exactly what we're telling you because we're following the insurance companies. Or do you think we could get enough of these Philip Avadias to turn it, enough of these Trokalasians? Where do you think we are on that?
It's interesting you mentioned Dr. Tro, because he recently came out with results from a 6-month pilot study with a large corporation where they implemented a low carbohydrate program together with continuous glucose monitors and an app, a cell phone based app. The average weight loss was, I believe, 38 pounds in 6 months' time. And they were able to improve people's cardiovascular risk scores by 44%. And they were able to save something like several $1,000s. I don't remember the exact number per patient, because they were coming off their medication. So their medications, their medication costs dropped, even though the level and intensity of this intervention by Dr. Tro and his team of health coaches, they had on average 600 contacts with each one of the patients in their program, like people contacting them, their, some kind of a health coach conversation,
Yeah.
something. So it's an
Yeah.
incredibly intense level of intervention. And I think probably the level of intervention that you really need in order to change somebody's lifestyle. It is dramatic, and the questions are many, abundant. So that's sort of stunning results. And I mentioned them. They're not a singular event. We could also talk about the Virta study. That Virta is a company doing
Sure.
this with
Yeah.
people with type 2 diabetes. But and so it presents like yet another force for change, which are all these self-insured companies paying their own health bills. And you can also see large insurers like Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's kind of self-insured systems where their costs are going wildly out of control. I mean, chronic diseases account for 3/4 of our spending on healthcare, at least. So you're talking about, a set of powerful interests that are also waking up to a new nutritional approach. And, not just, the company Dr. Tro worked for, but I think Virta, this other company, works with 100 different companies, including several Fortune 500 companies. The Veterans Administration did a highly successful project with Virta. There was a $10 million grant just granted to the Ohio State
Nice.
University for Dr. Jeff Volek for his work on the ketogenic diet for the military. So I see signs of some change. I cannot make any prognostications because we know that all predictions fail.
Yeah.
But it is a battle for the long run. Let's just say that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up these self-insured companies. Just a couple of years ago, right before I moved here, so it's been a couple of years now. Um, like you, I go off and give speeches to private, whoever calls, if they pay a fee, I get on the plane, I go. And I show up in San Francisco to do this convention. And you know me, Nina, I'm by the seat of my pants. I call and say, hey, let's do a show. And then we talk 5 minutes. We say, okay, what do you want to talk about? I do talks like that. When I'm walking in front of an audience, I very seldom know who I'm talking to an hour before the show. But the guy who got me to go to this convention took me for a steak the night before. And I said, by the way, this is insurance. I'm talking to insurance tomorrow. He goes, yeah. I said, do they want to hear from me? Are you sure you got the right guy? And he goes, oh, yeah, this is a convention for self-insured companies. And he explained the whole thing to me. And when he explained it, I went, of course, they're insuring their own people. Their best interest is that their people don't get sick. They want the best information for their people, right?
Right.
So in that case, a Vinnie or a Nina or a Gary Taubes, for that matter, we walk up and start spewing stuff. They're in the audience taking notes. These people aren't just there for the drinks and the bagels. They're there taking, and some of these, there were no Fortune 500. There could have been a Fortune 500 company or two, but these are large companies. These are multi-million dollar companies. And they're there trying to figure out how to keep their employees healthy without getting them on medication and everything else. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And as a matter of fact, when my talk was over with, they kept me on stage for another hour asking questions. In my entire life, I've never had that. In all of my speeches, like, thank you, good night. A handful of people track you out of the building. You try to break away from them. This was not that. I've never had anything like it in my life.
Well, they're sensitive and responsive to health outcomes and costs. They're not driven by ideology. They don't care about nutritional dogma. They don't care about getting an NIH grant. They're responsive to the data, maybe more than most. And if you are saving several $1,000s per patient, that is data that interests them because they have had zero success with their health and lifestyle programs, as we discussed, because they've been giving the wrong advice. So for them, that is powerful data. And they, so that's, and if they go with the food is medicine vegetarian program that is sort of the favored option coming out of Harvard and Tufts and many of the sort of the elite nutrition groups, they will not see those benefits. There's no evidence on them. There's no evidence that those programs, there's hardly any data on those programs, but we know that they're when that diet, like the vegetarian or the dietary guideline diet, higher fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, that does not swivel diseases into reverse and get people off medications. In the scientific literature, we don't see it. So listen, Vinny, I hate to do this. I'd love to talk to you
I was just
about
going
your
to tell you,
experience, but I have to go.
Yeah, I wanted to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much, Nina, for coming on. I'm going to let you rock and roll. I'm going to give your plugs and everything after the show. So thank you. And I look forward to having you on again really soon.
Okay, thank you so much, Vinny. Great to be here. I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
I have a new Substack newsletter that you can subscribe to, currently free, called Unsettled Science. So go on to substack.com and look up Unsettled Science and please subscribe.
We will mention that again in the show notes. Thank you, Nina,
Great.
and love having you
Thank
on.
you.
Hope to see you again soon.
Okay, thank you, Vinny. Take care.